Okay, so now I'm going to talk about battle identification. This is a very advanced speedrunning technique, the mechanics of which could apply to both Platinum and Heart Gold Soul Silver. However, I'm going to be focusing on Heart Gold Soul Silver only in this video because it actually has no applications within Platinum speedrunning, at least in the main categories, whereas it does have two implications in Heart Gold Soul Silver. Those two implications are Faulkner and Whitney. This technique can be used on. So I want to stress as well that this technique is not required for speedrunning Heart Gold Soul Silver at all. It is a very advanced technique and it requires a lot of knowledge and information to be able to implement usefully at all. But if you do have that knowledge and information at your disposal, it can be quite helpful for those two fights. So even though it is more potent against Whitney, I'm actually going to focus on Faulkner first, because Faulkner has something else before we get into the battle identification that is why the battle identification is actually used for Faulkner. So I'm going to bring up my spreadsheet that I use to help when I'm mapping all of this out. This is my Faulkner spreadsheet. And so all of these values are basically different RNG values at different points of the fight. So over here in column B is basically all of the starting RNG seeds that you could be looking at. And then over here, the rows are, once the RNG has advanced 11 times, this is what the actual RNG value will be at that point, and then 16 and 17, etc. There's a lot of columns that I've got hidden because I'm just doing it. I'll show you, for example, like I'm just doing very manual calculations. If I show them that it's like, this is what happens, and then it's at frame 1. Yeah, the first frame. The RNG advanced, and then the second one, etc. And yes, please laugh at me for using Excel and doing this and being so stubborn and never learning any programming. But anyway, so the point is, at the 11th RNG frame, the game calculates what move Faulkner is going to use. So Faulkner's Pidgey has two moves. It's got Tackle and Sand Attack. And so he has very basic AI for this choice in that it simply divides the upper half of the RNG by 2. And if the result is 0, like the remainder, if it's 0, it picks Tackle. And if it's 1, it picks Sand Attack. And so because of the very specific way that the RNG actually advances in this game, like the calculation for the multiplication and what it adds to the value of the RNG is consistent, it just so happens that at 11 times when doing this check, it actually gives the same result for many, many frames in a row. So you can see these all say 0, and if I scroll up, it'll say 0 for a long time as well, until we get to here where it switches over to 1, and then it does the same thing again. So from like 248 down to, this should be like 401? Yep, 401. All of them are 0, so it's picking Tackle. So that's for 153 or 4 frames in a row. Faulkner will pick Tackle. And then he'll switch to picking Sand Attack, and then he'll pick Sand Attack for the next 154 frames. So that's about 2.5 seconds. It's a bit over. And because you much, much prefer for him to pick Tackle than to pick Sand Attack, because once you pick Sand Attack, you can miss, and also you actually want the damage from Tackle, it is worth it to try and aim for one of these clusters where he picks Tackle. Now, because of lag frame variance within the game, you're not going to be able to get the exact seed that you might want to hit, but if you aim for, say, right in the middle of one of these Tackle clusters, even if you're getting lag frame variance of 60 frames here or there on either side, you're still probably going to be getting Tackle. The overwhelming majority of time, you should be able to hit a Tackle cluster and get Tackle. And then if you don't make it in time to hit, this particular cluster, you then wait just a bit over 5 seconds, and then you hit the next Tackle cluster, or the next Tackle cluster, or the next Tackle cluster, etc. And so this technique is used by most top-level runners when they're doing a category that involves manip. So not a category that is manipless. They'll be trying to hit one of these Tackle clusters. That's not quite battle identification. Battle identification is the next step afterwards. So because you're hitting, or you're aiming to hit one of these tackle clusters, if you do get tackle, you can go, okay, there is 153 different seeds that this could possibly be. And I know what those 153 seeds could be. Now, that number is still too high to be able to do anything beyond just the standard strat and hoping for the best, which against Faulkner is basically just use Ember and hope Pidgeotto isn't picking Roost or doesn't crit you right at the end. But say, for instance, something particular happens in the fight that isn't common. So let's say, for instance, and that's what's the point of all of these different rows here. So say Pidgey crits me after it picks tackle. So to do that, I'm just going to pick all of the ones where this value is 0, and then he crits me. And so now we're looking at, okay, well now there's only 10 different fights that could be. That's still probably a bit too much. You would probably, when you get to that kind of level, you're still on the standard strat. You're just spamming Ember. But then if something else happens, you can go, okay, you know, if one of your Embers burn from there, for example, on Pidgeotto, you can go, okay, well now there's only one possible seed that could be, because that's a 10% chance. But to try and speed up the process, let's say the roll from that tackle is a max roll. There's only one possible seed that could be now. So if it picks tackle and it's a max roll, so it does 12 with tackle, there's only one seed that could be. And so if I now go to the Faulkner fight, let's move that back in front. I'm going to start this up again, and I'm going to inject that seed into the emulator for testing purposes. And then we start the fight, and so if Pidgey then uses tackle and it gets a max roll, it does 12. So I would, if that happens in the middle of a run, if I'm aiming for this cluster and I see tackle and it does 12, I go, okay, now I can identify, I know I'm on this seed. So I'm not actually trying to aim for this seed, but once I get it, I can go, okay, I know what the seed is. And so in preparation for doing battle identification, I want to be going through every single one of the possible fights I can be getting and mapping them out, so that if I can identify I am on this seed, I then know, okay, well, what is the best possible thing for me to do from this scenario? And so in this scenario, I'm just going to kill Pidgey. Because generally when I'm mapping it out, it's more about what do you do against Pidgeotto. Generally, you do just want to take the Pidgey out turn 1. Depending on what happens, if you get like a burn, you might want to actually kill with tackle. But just for this instance, to show it off in a really easy way, we'll go to the Pidgeotto. And so the standard strat would be to just use Ember, right? And then you're just hoping Pidgeotto doesn't pick Roost. Though in this case, it's not going to be able to pick Roost because it can kill me on the next turn. And so you would just use Ember and then kind of be hoping for the best. And you would actually win in this circumstance. But if we go back here, I kind of haven't explained what these little squares are. So this is a custom Lua script that I've got on the emulator that's showing different instances that can happen in the battle RNG. And so the way to read this is what's going to happen, is something interesting going to happen on the next turn that I choose, and then the RNG advances from left to right and then top to bottom. So it goes this way, this way, this way. And so these different squares mean, for example, the yellow square means if I pick Ember, it's going to burn. The red square means it will be a critical. So it's basically the 1 in 16 roll will occur. The green one means tackle will miss. It means a 95% accurate move will miss. And the brown one means a 90% accurate move will miss. But a 95% one will not miss. It's actually optimized for Whitney, which I'll get to later. But so this red one, as I mentioned before, that's a critical. And so when I was using Ember before, I skipped over this little red square by the time I got to my next attack. But so if I go back to this turn and I pick Tackle instead of Ember, Tackle will advance the RNG by 1 less than Ember, because it's not checking for will this move burn, because tackle can't inflict a status condition. If I used Leer, it would do even less advances, because it then wouldn't be checking for will this move critical, how much damage does this move do, and Pidgeotto also will not check, it won't do an AI check for should I use Roost, because it's at full health. Miltank would do the same thing for should I use Milk Drink. If it's at full health, it doesn't do that check. But so if I use Tackle, it'll advance the RNG by 1 less than Ember. And now that red square is on my next turn. And so now if I were to use Ember, it will critical and it will kill the Pidgeotto. Easy. And so if I get that exact instance in a run where I'm aiming for that specific cluster, get the tackle 12, I then know, okay, I can use Ember to finish Pidgey, then against Pidgeotto, if I go tackle Ember, that Ember will critical and it will kill Pidgeotto every single time. That's just one instance, of course. When I'm doing battle identification, I want to know, okay, what about if I burn? What about if Pidgey misses tackle? What about if Pidgey gets a good roll on tackle, etc., etc., to be able to gain as much knowledge as possible so that I can identify as many seeds as possible. Now, against Faulkner, you're not going to be able to identify most seeds because the most common thing is the most common things occur, right? Ember doesn't burn, Pidgey doesn't critical, Pidgey hits the tackle, etc. And then you get to the Pidgeotto and you actually haven't been able to get anything to identify or narrow down what the seeds are until you get to the point where Pidgeotto either picks Roost or doesn't pick Roost. And if it doesn't pick Roost, that's great. I then win the fight. But if it picks Roost, it's, well, now this fight is bad. But you still can get a decent amount of seeds where you can identify against Faulkner and get better fights as a result. Now, against Whitney, and why she is the most potent example of battle identification, it's because Whitney has the best possible move for identifying seeds. And that is Metronome. The reason Metronome is such a good identifier is because Metronome can call so many different moves. So Whitney's Clefairy can call, I think it's 442 different moves. So just on that alone, you know, we were looking at before, Pidgey crits tackle and it's a max roll. So that's 2 1 in 16 chances. So that would be an identification like breakdown of 1 in 256, roughly. So Metronome's already 442, it's already higher. But if you see Metronome as well, that's another times 3 because she's an equal chance to pick either Metronome, Double Slap, or Mimic. So that's then over 1300. So basically, if you see Metronome, you can almost certainly, assuming you're entering the fight at a reasonably similar time within... So basically you're aiming for a specific cluster again. You can almost certainly identify what the seed is based on if she picks Metronome, what that Metronome is. And so that seed that I've pulled up there is actually what she gets in my PB run. She uses Metronome and she picks Splash. And so if I... when I'm mapping this out, actually I should switch... this back on top. The Whitney one. So if she were to pick Splash, let's just, for completeness sake, go, okay, so she picks Metronome. So Metronome is 2 on this one. So that's the AI choice, like Tackle that I showed you before, except there's 3 different options. So 0 is Double Slap, 1 is Mimic, and 2 is Metronome. She actually does have a 4th move, which is Encore. Funnily enough, the only way she will ever pick Encore is if she first uses Metronome and then Disable, then she will always pick Encore on the next turn. But anyway, if we then go to the Metronome call, so that's over here, Splash is 149. If it calls 149, that would be Splash, and you can see there's only one possible seed that could be. And so then when I'm routing out, again, you have to have all of this information done before you actually start the run. So I know, because I've put in the time, that, okay, if I see metronome splash from starting the Whitney fight at around 47:55, the best way to do this fight isn't to follow the set path. The set path in the case of fighting Miltank would be to go Lear, Lear. Oh, she's picked Attract. I now can't use Flame Wheel. It's basically you use Lear at least 2 times, and then you're trying to use Flame Wheel once Flame Wheel will kill the Miltank in 2 hits, basically to prevent it from picking Milk Drink. So I would now try and pick a 3rd Lear. It will be immobile, I can tell by looking at these squares. I will not get through. Then she's going to pick Stomp. It's going to critical me and get a max roll, and then I'm just immobile again. It's awful. Rollout happens. This fight sucks. But because I've mapped it out, I actually know the best thing to do in this scenario is to use Cut. Force her to use Milk Drink, because if I then go Lear here, if you have a look at the squares again, I'm now going to critical, and the next one is red as well. And so the next RNG check after is this move going to critical is the damage roll. So it's actually going to crit and max roll. So it's effectively what you saw before where she picked Stomp, it criticaled, and it did 39. That's a crit max roll. I can now do that to her because the RNG has advanced as many times as it has from this position. And then my next Flame Wheel will just be able to kill, and I don't even need Blaze to beat her. So that's what battle identification is. That's how it works. And so for Whitney, it's not just metronome. Metronome is just the best one, but she actually has so many other different things that can happen in the fight that are really good for identifying. So one of the other moves that she has is double slap, right? So if I go back to... we'll go back to having this up top. So double slap is actually a really good identifier. Obviously, it's nowhere near as good as metronome. But double slap, because it hits you multiple times, it's giving you multiple different chances to see a critical or a high damage roll. And it's giving you feedback for how many times it hits. It allows you to narrow it down as well. Not only that, but the first turn against Whitney, you're hitting her with Flame Wheel. So you're looking at chances to burn. You're also looking at, does Cute Charm activate from Flame Wheel? You know, does the double slap miss, etc., etc. So if you're looking at all of these different seeds, and so because the Whitney fight as well is deeper into the run than Faulkner, you're looking at a higher frame window that you could be hitting. You're looking at more than 150 wide, because the lag frame variance is going to be higher by the time you get to Whitney. But so if we're looking at, say, the Flame Wheel burns, and then we're looking at, so that's already narrowed it down by quite a bit. So she's picked double slap and the Ember burn. So I've got like 500 different seeds in this cluster that I'm potentially looking at, and it's already narrowed it down by quite a few. But then, say the double slap hits 4 times. I'm not even looking at how much damage all of those hits do yet. So, and allow me to just rant about how they decide how double slap works. So when I'm mapping all of this out, I have to figure out what all of the things that determine actions within the game are. So I actually had no idea how the game determines how many times double slap hits you, right? And so I knew the odds are it's a 3 in 8 chance to hit twice. It's a 3 in 8 chance to hit 3 times. It's a 1 in 8 chance to hit 4 times. And it's a 1 in 8 chance to hit 5 times. So you would think at some point it's just dividing the RNG by 8, dividing it up into 8s, and then if it's like, oh, if it's 0, 1, or 2, then it would do 2, and if it's 3, 4, or 5, it would do 3, and then if it's 6, it would do 4, and if it was 7, it would do 8. But that's not what it does. Instead, it has a check for, it divides it by 4, so 0, 1, 2, or 3, and then if it's 2 or 3, it then does a secondary check. And then if that one is 2, it does 4. And if it's 3, it does 5. Otherwise, if either of them are 0, it does 2. And if either of them are 1, it does 3. Very silly. But anyway, So to determine if it's going to hit me 4 times, this one would have to be 2 or 3, and then that one would be 2, right? I've already narrowed it down. There's only one seed that I can possibly get for if I burn her, she picks double slap, and it hits 4 times. So you're actually a pretty decent chance to be able to get an identifier, even if you don't get metronome. Mimic is not very helpful, but if you get cute charm from Mimic and then you don't get through the cute charm, she could then be picking metronome or double slap or whatever. You can still, you know, have a decent chance at identifying from that point onwards. But this does take a lot of work and a lot of preparing, because you have to map out all of these different iterations and know exactly what to do in the moment when it comes. And you've also got to map out many different clusters, because again, you're not going to get to Whitney or Faulkner at exactly the same time every single run, because there's so much variance in every other run. So I've mapped out, how many is it? 14 different clusters for Whitney. And so I tend to map them out by 5-second intervals. So if I get to Whitney I'll try and start the fight at, you know, either 47.55 or 48 flat or 48.05, etc., just to try and reduce the burden on myself for how many different fights I have to map out. Because all of the preparation work for doing this in total has taken me about 1,000 hours just to try and get all of the data in me so that when I do runs, I can actually correctly identify and then do the right thing against Whitney. And so if I wanted to do it for every single second, that would be 5 times as much work, and it's not really worth putting in that many hours into it to try and reduce potentially not waiting for, on average, 2.5 seconds to start the fight. Because if I just dedicated that time to instead doing runs, I'm probably going to get a run that's 2.5 seconds luckier, you know? And so the other question that you might be asking is, well, are there other fights where you could use this technique? I understand you can do it on Faulkner and Whitney, but are there others? And so the answer to that's kind of yes and no. So an example of where you potentially might be able to use it is right after Whitney is this double fight, where you fight 2 Clefables and 2 Wigglytuffs at the same time. And the Clefable's no metronome. And as I've just explained, metronome is the perfect identifier. The reason, however, that I do not do battle identification in this fight is, 1, it's actually not that helpful. Because this fight is, even if you could identify the fight, it's going to go the same way almost every single time. Because you're just going to take out the Wigglytuff and then take out the Clefable in the same way. If you get a bad metronome that ends up killing one of your Pokemon, well, the fight's just screwed anyway. So there's a very, very small amount of times where even if you could identify, it's actually going to change your actions to get a better outcome. The second point is metronome is actually way less common on this fight. Whereas against Whitney, it's a 1 in 3 chance to get metronome. This AI is highly, highly weighted to pick its other moves. So picking double slap or picking growl. The other thing is you don't always enter this fight at the same amount of health. So in this one, I've got 12 health on Quilava. But depending on what happens against Whitney, you generally want to enter this fight in Blaze. Blaze is very helpful. So 1/3 or max of 1/3 or less of your max health. Blaze is very helpful for this fight and for the next fight afterwards. But when you're doing battle identification, it is best utilized when you're entering in the same conditions, so basically the same amount of health, and almost the only way to control the same amount of health is to have the max amount of health that you can have, and you do not want max health for this fight. And so the reason that's important, of course, is if you are at different amounts of health, the same RNG will actually give different outcomes, because it's like, you know, if Clefable uses a move that does 12 damage to me, it's going to kill me. But if I'm at 14 health, it won't kill me. Or even if it uses a metronome that's, you know, it could be Splash, right? It does nothing. At 12 health, the best thing to do might be to just, okay, well, I'm not going to target Clefable. I'm going to kill the other Clefable. Everything will be fine. But the next turn might actually be it picks double slap and does 12 damage. And so that's fine if I'm at more than 12 health, but if I'm not at more than 12 health, I will die. And so you won't actually have one kind of decisive, this is the best thing to do in this scenario. You would actually have to map it out for different health as well, and that's just way too much work to be worth it. And so basically for a fight like this, you would end up losing more time just waiting for the clusters on average than you would save by being able to identify in a cluster, if that makes sense. Like, because I'm saying I map out like 5-second clusters for Whitney, if I did that for this fight as well, I would wait on average 2.5 seconds before starting the fight. And doing so wouldn't save on average 2.5 seconds in the fight. So it doesn't make sense to do it. The one that you might be thinking of that maybe it would make sense here and save enough time on average is against red. And that's because so many runs die to red, right? And there is a lot of variance in the fight. If you get a really good red fight, it definitely does save more than 2.5 seconds. There are quite a few reasons that this technique is not done against red, though. So the first one is you're not getting that much feedback on the fight, because unlike against Faulkner and Whitney, where you're attacking at the same time as they're attacking, against red, the fight starts by you using X items. So you boost your defense, and then you boost your special, and then you use a full restore, and then you start attacking, and you're using Thunderbolt, right? And so you're not actually getting that much feedback to be able to identify what the seed is that you've hit. Red's also always going to be picking the same moves. He's not picking random moves, he's picking his best move, he's picking Volt Tackle, and then on this turn he's going to pick Quick Attack. So you're not getting feedback there either. The most identifiable thing that could happen is if he criticals you. But if he criticals you, you're dead. So even if you could possibly identify in that scenario, it doesn't help because you're dead, so the run is over. The other reason that it really doesn't help against red is against Faulkner and Whitney, the frames and the time match up, because the same, like, when you reach Whitney, for example, I'm saying, all right, 47 minutes and 55 seconds have passed for this cluster. And I can go, okay, well, based on that, the frame count is going to be this much, because at about 47 minutes and 55 seconds, it's going to be this many frames have passed in the game. And yes, there's going to be some variance because of lag frames, but it's going to be about this much. I can say this is going to be the average center point of this cluster. But that's not the case for red. And the reason it's not the case for red is because you reset the game after the Elite Four, and the frame count starts from when you've last started the game. But the time starts from when you obviously set the time of the DS clock, which happens before the run actually starts. And so if it takes you 2.5 hours to beat the Elite Four, but then you reset the game, the time will have passed by 2 hours and 30 minutes. But the frame count resets from that point. So the amount of frames that have passed by the time you get to red is only the amount that you've spent in the Kanto section of the game. But the time is the entirety of the run. So the amount of frames that have passed won't actually mirror up to how many seconds have passed or how many minutes have passed for the DS clock. So effectively what that means is you can't wait for, like I do against Whitney, can't wait for, okay, 47 minutes and 55 seconds have passed, now I'm going to hit this cluster. Because if you were to do that, you're going to be hitting either, depending on how you're determining what 47 minutes and 55 seconds look like, either not the same amount of frames every run or not the same amount of seconds every run, which means you will get different results. And so if you just aim for the frames, you could look at whether that's going to critical, because the frame count is what determines things like criticals or whatever. But you won't be able to determine things like, will Blizzard miss? And that's kind of the most important thing. So you could, if you mapped out, say, let's just say, for instance, some seed that looks like the Whitney seed that I was looking at before, 3B OC, 4E 7D or whatever, and you go, okay, well, this seed doesn't get criticaled by any attack throughout the whole run. But if it was on a different second and it was 3C or whatever, on that seed, Snorlax might miss Blizzard instead of what you've mapped out, and then that will advance the RNG by less to the point where it could actually now land on a seat that gets critical. So if you wanted to map it out for red, you would have to map out every second and every frame. So you would have to map out 60 times as many clusters to be able to do it. And it's going to give you very, very little use, because the only use you could really get out of it is either A, knowing, okay, I will get critical here, so do something different, which is basically either don't attack and heal instead to try and advance the RNG by a different amount, or to be able to say, okay, I know either, you know, he's going to miss Blizzard or I'm going to critical, so I don't have to heal. I can take the risk because I know I'm going to get a good outcome here. Because you have choice specs on as well during this fight and you're using Thunderbolt, you can't go like I was against Whitney where I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to do Leah Flame Wheel. I'm actually going to use Cut. Because you've got choice specs on, you kind of have to use Thunderbolt. You can't just use Rock Climb for a turn, because then you would be locked into Rock Climb, or it wouldn't let you if it wasn't the first turn. So it doesn't actually have that much utility against red. Theoretically, though, if you put in 60,000 hours of work, you could have a very small chance of identifying and saving a little bit of time. But at this stage of my life, I would rather play the game. I hope that has in some way explained battle RNG and battle identification a bit more. As I mentioned, this is a very advanced technique that I use in runs. And so it's basically, if you see me doing a run and I'm on Whitney and you see me do something bizarre, but then suddenly I get a critical, it's because I knew what I was doing. I've identified what was going on. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something.